Good afternoon, welcome. We are the Shoemaker Shop, and we welcome you to another Trades Tuesday. And for those of you who have visited us in the past, you probably noticed we are in different surroundings. Normally, you will find us located between Greenhouse Store and the Weave Shop. There we portray the shoe shop of George Wilson, which was operating during the pre-war years of 1773 to 1774. Presently, we are located in the yard of the Public Armory, where we are representing the Public Shoe Factory, which was run by Matthew Anderson, the brother of James Anderson, the blacksmith running the yard, from approximately 1777 to 1780 in the fall when the shop was relocated to Warwick, Virginia. Due to the need for social distancing, we had to adapt to changing environments, much like our predecessors during the War for Independence. In George Wilson's shop, we would tell you that we just strictly focus on making men's shoes, and the shop was advertising they were buying the best English leather. In this Public Shoe Factory, we certainly will tell you we make new shoes, but we might do mending as well, as long as other leather projects such as bridle and harness work. And there was an enslaved man, Davy, dressing leather for use in the Public Shoe Factory, something George Wilson would not have had to worry about. And also you're getting leather from public tan yards where pre-war you're getting English shoe leather. And the way someone is fitted with shoes will often depend on which shop is making them. In George Wilson's shop, there would be an inventory, approximately the equivalent of 8 to 11.5 U.S. men's sizes in stock. If you buy your shoes much like today, you would buy your foot size. If you did not have your size, we would offer to make to measure. Working in a public factory like this, we are making set sizes to fit as many soldiers' feet as we possibly can. Men in the Virginia Army and Navy are not getting shoes made to measure. And also, in George Wilson's shop, he's looking for shoemakers to do a range of different shoes. Common shoes, fine shoes, boots, men wood-heeled shoes. Whereas working in a state factory such as this, we are basically just focusing on coarse and common work. Most Virginia soldiers, their transportation is walking by foot. No need for riding boots. And that's probably one big difference, the interaction. We're making shoes in this public factory that get put in a barrel and shipped off. We're not beating the people we're making the footwear for, much like the customers that would have been visiting George Wilson's shop. But even though many things are different, some things remain the same. The way shoemaking occurs and the people involved do not change over time. In pre-war Virginia, we would tell you free and enslaved make shoes for individuals. It's the same in this government shop. And you're in the government shop or in a civilian shop pre-war, you're making shoes for a diverse group of people. In George Wilson's shop, we are making shoes for enslaved men, farmers, tradesmen, even gentry. In this government shop, we're making shoes for enslaved men forced to do work for the state, such as the men in the public hospital, for tradesmen working in other trade shops, such as ours, and even men in the Virginia Army and Navy. No matter who you are, free or enslaved, in peacetime or wartime, military or civilian, slaves are a necessity. Shoes provide the traction required by people of every condition to achieve their goals in life, whether fighting for independence, striving to secure your rights or liberties, or even going to the store. My name is Val, and I've been with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for 19 years, and in 2018, in the fall, I was made master of the shoe shop. And some of the current projects I'm working on, much like the shop we portray, we have trouble getting the leather we need, so I've been practicing with period leather dressing. And after curing for a year, we're currently using it on the footwear we are making for our colleagues. I finished up doing several repairs, and now I'm building up a last for the character interpreter who plays young Colonel Washington. Our shop will also be making him some riding boots. Before the war, planters like Washington were ordering shoes from a London shoe shop, such as Didsbury. And thankfully, some of the correspondence survives, so we get an idea on what we should be making for him as far as style goes.
My name is Nicole. I'm in the third year of my apprenticeship in the shoe shop Colonial Williamsburg. I'm currently working on the arch support for a pair of double-soled common shoes for one of our blacksmiths. And my next project is a pair of common shoes for one of the apprentices in our foodways program. Today we do make the shoes for our coworkers. We're not going to get to everybody. Much like the public shoe factory, it's a numbers game. We're not going to win, but we do what we can to provide as many of our coworkers as possible with proper 18th century shoes. As Val said, you probably would not have been buying shoes bespoke, made to order. Most people could just buy them in common sizes, popular styles, though you had the ability to get made to order if that was something you needed. For our shoe shop today, we tend to make to order more often than not. The materials that would have been readily available for us before the war are scarce. There are now cheaper and faster ways of tanning that produce leather that we can't manipulate with hand tools and water the way we can with bark tanned leather. So due to the conservation of materials, we tend to make to order more often than not.
My name is Rob. I'm a fifth-year apprentice here in the shop. Currently, I'm working on a reproduction of a pair of shoes that's based on an original that was found in the Brafferton building at William and Mary. It dates to about the 1730s. It's a pretty fine shoe, so it's certainly not the sort of thing, both stylistically and construction-wise, that would have come out of this military shop in the Revolutionary War. But it's a very challenging shoe to reproduce. And we have it in our collections here at Williamsburg, the original, that is. And it's by studying the original shoes, by examining them in archaeological collections here at Williamsburg or elsewhere in the United States, that we really inform the process of what we do with the work here in the shop. We study those shoes, we draw them, and from those drawings and our notes, we're able to create patterns that we can then use and scale to make footwear for our coworkers, so that we know that, if not by size, at least by construction and by style, they are wearing exactly what would have been worn in the period. Now, we've given you a good bit of background to what we do in the shop on a daily basis and what we're representing, but we'd like to turn the conversation over to you. What are you interested in? Feel free to ask about the people that did this work, the work itself, or really anything that leaps to mind. So please, ask away.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, Nicole, and Val, for welcoming us into your shop today. We're definitely very excited to have the opportunity to ask you some questions. We were wondering if you might be able to speak more on who exactly was involved in the shoemaking trade, both before, during, and after the American Revolution, and what exactly motivated these people to do their work?
Well, when it comes to who's doing the shoemaking work, the answer really is everybody. It's a trade that is so universally needed. I mean, you can't get through life without a pair of shoes. That you have just about anyone you could think of involved with the production of footwear. Now, like most trades in the 18th century, it is incredibly male-dominated. That said, there are certainly women that are involved in the trade. Here in North America, there is always going to be enslaved labor involved with shoemaking, as with any trade. In Williamsburg, we know the names of the masters of the shops usually, and that comes to us from newspaper advertisements. But there are very few shoemakers that we know by name. The exception would be several enslaved individuals. Val mentioned Davy, who worked in the public shoe factory and was owned by Matthew Anderson. In addition to dressing leather, we know Davy made at least 16 pairs of shoes, which would indicate that he had some considerable skill at shoemaking. Elsewhere, and I believe we do have an advertisement for this, at Pearson's Tannery, which is located about a mile from where we are now. It's outside the current historic area. Pearson's Tannery used a lot of enslaved labor, and many of these men were quite skilled. When Pearson died in 1777, his estate was inventoried, and it's through that inventory and the advertisement that was run in the Virginia Gazette that we were able to discover that there were at least 2 enslaved men on that site that were making shoes at the tannery. I believe that their names were Sam and Will. And the way that we were able to determine who they were was by how they were valued on that estate inventory. They had a higher value placed on them because of that skill than a less skilled individual doing more general work at the tannery. Now, as I said, Nicole can speak a little bit more to women's involvement with the trade.
As Rob said, it's definitely, shoemaking is a male-dominated trade, but women aren't barred from trade work. You're not going to see women as full practitioners in professions, but shoemaking, it's something that men and women are both going to be involved in. Most of the time, women are going to be in the support roles for trades, which makes sense when you look at how labor intensive running a household is. To have entirely 2 full-time jobs, this is a time before you're going to have a stove or running water or refrigeration. So when we see women in trade work, it's often in piecework where you can support the trade. Sewing together the tops of the shoes, closing work as we would call it, was often farmed out to contract laborers. Then you as the owner of the shop can pay that person less. They don't have to be trained as a shoemaker. It's something that you can learn fairly quickly and get good at in a reasonable amount of time. Once a child's able to sit still and listen, they can pick it up as well, and you get paid for how many of those uppers are brought in. And that is where we tend to see the most women involved in the trade. We do also see women as fully trained shoemakers. There was a couple apprehended at a jail in Pennsylvania that probably indentured, based on the way the ad reads, John and Elizabeth Humphreys, who are listed as both shoemakers. We also see women who own shoe shops. Most of the time that's when the owner of the shop dies and his wife inherits the business. That happens with John Wilson, the brother of George Wilson, the shop that we usually represent. John passes away and his wife Mary and brother George inherit the business together. That partnership lasts less than a year. George moves to Williamsburg. Mary continues to run that business, looks like until her death about a decade later. There was a woman in Boston named Elizabeth Shaw. She was, by her advertisement, a fully trained shoemaker. She learned both men's and women's shoes, which was a bit unusual. She opened her own business, and that is what made a master shoemaker. It wasn't a designation of skill. It was a denotion of business ownership. So it's not the most common thing, but it wasn't a novelty either.
Excellent. Well, Bruce, Michael, and some others are wondering specifically about how long it might take you to make a shoe or a pair of shoes, and also what process really goes into making a shoe.
Well, you're paid piecework. So one shoemaker thought that it took about 10 or 12 years to become a good shoemaker. From the bundle of parts, you should be able to put that together in a day. But in order to do that, we have a 4-step division of labor. There's a person called a clicker. So oftentimes the master might do that. They'll do the cutting of the parts. Then Nicole mentioned people sewing uppers. That's the job of a closer. They'll sew the upper, the top of the shoe together. Then from that bundle, it depends on the shoe, but we'll say common shoes. A good shoemaker, probably this time of year, hopefully in a day, they'll finish a pair and maybe start another pair. Then a rag-a-rough does the cleaning and finishing. And I saw an ad for an enslaved shoemaker in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and in a week, 6 days, you can make about 7 pairs of shoes. So I think your goal is to finish a pair in a day and maybe start another pair, especially this time of year.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Now, maybe moving in a similar direction, once that shoe is made, are shoes quite expensive for people to purchase during this period?
There's a pretty broad range of costs when it comes to shoes. They are items of necessity, and if we're making shoes that most of our customers can't afford, then that's no good for us either. So there is going to be a range of prices. Converting 18th century shillings to modern US dollars is something that we really can't do. You're paying if the coin, doesn't matter what it looks like, what matters is what metal is it made out of, how much does it weigh, and each colony can regulate its own currency. So here in Williamsburg before the war, it looks like you might find shoes from under 3 Virginia shillings all the way up to 20. And while we can't convert that, if you are a productive tradesman here in town at that same time, 5 or 6 shillings is a good day's pay. That gives you a range of prices. We're thinking you probably would not want to spend more than you could personally earn in a day on what you considered to be average. That means we're going to have cheaper shoes than what a tradesman thinks of as a day's pay. So we have coarse shoes that are undyed leather, bigger stitches, less finish work. That's going to be cheaper. Shoes shipped in from England were also coming in a bit cheaper. Same reason why shoes not made in the United States tend to be cheaper today. It's your labor costs. There were so many shoemakers in England that suppressed their wages. And you can throw a whole bunch of shoes in a barrel, ship them across the sea, and your per pair shipping cost is pretty low. So perhaps instead of going to a local shop and buying that common shoe, you're buying an English common shoe. You could also buy shoes at estate sales. There was definitely a market for secondhand shoes. If a free person could not afford a pair of secondhand shoes, they could apply to the church. We do have the established Church of England, and one of the reasons we're paying a church tax is to provide people with items of necessity they couldn't otherwise afford. For an enslaved person, they're usually going to receive shoes from the slaveholder. People work better if they're wearing proper shoes and proper clothing, so from the point of view of that slaveholder, they're seeing this as an investment, just as they're seeing that human being and their labor as an investment. For as to what kinds of shoes they're getting along that price scale, that's going to have a lot to do with what they're being forced to do. If a shoemaker, or if a person is working in a field, they're probably getting cheaper, coarser shoes, which may have been made directly on the plantation. Sometimes we'll see essentially a shoe operation on the plantation to cut external costs, particularly with mending. William Lee, who rides with Washington throughout the war, it looks like that is what he ends up doing at Mount Vernon following the war. Someone who is dressed in livery is going to have shoes that go with that. Eve, who's essentially lady's maid to Mrs. Randolph, is probably wearing high-heeled fabric upper shoes because she is a reflection on Mrs. Randolph. So there is a wide range of prices, not just in your shoes, but in the buckles that fasten the shoes as well. So it would be difficult to look at someone and know just by what they're wearing on their feet how well they were or weren't doing. But this is an accessible product. And it's a disposable one, too.
Great. Building off of that, would it be common for people to have more than one pair of shoes? And if so, maybe we could speak a little bit to how long we might expect these shoes to last.
Yeah, we believe that it is fairly common for people to have multiple pairs of shoes. Because, as Nicole said, they are, pretty affordable products and mass-produced. And that's something to keep in mind with this stuff, that these weren't lovingly bespoke for every single person. They were churned out, and some of the work and the working conditions reflect that. I mean, these are real factories in many cases. It's possible that someone of kind of average, ordinary station and means has anywhere from 5 to 6 pairs of shoes at a time in the period. And people in less fortunate circumstances, down to the enslaved individuals, may only have a single pair of shoes. When we look at soldiers in the Army, British Army, soldiers usually have 2 pairs of shoes at a time. The Continental Army, it's very hit or miss, but usually only 1 pair of shoes at a time. How long you get out of them, that really depends on what you're doing in them, and how hard you are in them, and also what type of shoe it is. If you look at a men's common shoe, the most typical shoe of the time, we have a photo of that, I believe, that's a fairly robust shoe. It has a good, decent heel on it, a decently thick sole, and importantly, that sole is sewn onto what's called a welt, which is a separate strip of leather sewn around the outer edge of the shoe. That means it's a very repairable shoe, and it can be mended and kept going for quite a bit of time. For a soldier in the British Army, they probably get a year out of that type of shoe, provided they get it fixed every 3 months or so. For a civilian, if you had multiple pairs of shoes and you could kind of rotate through them, different shoes for different circumstances, or multiple pairs of shoes of a certain type, probably the ones that you wear more often, you may be getting 4 or 6 months out of a pair of shoes before you go to a cobbler to get it fixed. A cobbler different from a shoemaker, where shoemakers are just making new shoes and cobblers are fixing old ones. If you're going to that cobbler every 4 to 6 months and you're otherwise taking care of the shoe, cleaning and conditioning it on a regular basis, you could get conceivably 2 or 3 years out of a pair of shoes. Today, where we're trying to shepherd these things along for our coworkers as much as possible, we can get 3 or 4 years on average for a pair of shoes, and we do a lot of repair work to make that happen. Personally, I've gotten 6 years out of a pair of shoes, and I wore them absolutely to death and mended them probably more times than was reasonable at a level that was perhaps unreasonable, certainly unreasonable for somebody in the period. And like I said, the type of shoe is going to matter. So actually, I'm working on a repair right now, and this shoe is a lightweight type of shoe that was, at the time, really ideal for athletic wear or for dancing. It's a very flexible type of shoe based on its construction technique, but to get that flexibility, you have to compromise on durability. if you were to wear this shoe up and down a street, or as a soldier, wear it and go on a march, it's really not going to give you the durability that you want. You can see here that this person has worn right through the sole of the shoe and really blown that out. And this type of shoe is not normally repairable. However, it can be done. It's just not that attractive, and it certainly won't be the same flexible shoe it was before. I've got its mate here, and you can see that I've stitched on a new piece, and I've managed to get that sewn all the way around. But this is kind of a temporary thing. It's not going to give him probably much more than another 6 months out of this shoe. And then I'd say this is going to be heading towards just being trash at that point. But this is certainly something that we see in the period. In fact, the way I've fixed this shoe is directly copied from an original shoe found on a shipwreck up in Maine.
So Elizabeth and Amanda were wondering a little bit about the materials you're making shoes from, but specifically, are you making shoes in different colors other than just black and brown?
It depends on what we're making. So men like black. So black's a popular color. It's easy to get the leather black. It's easy to refresh it. And some think black is a popular color due to the buckle. You have a plain black shoe, you highlight the buckle. The shop we represent, the civilian shop, Wilson, he advertises Morocco leather. That as it tends to be more brightly colored. So maybe for men's shoes, you might see Morocco colored slippers like red, blue, green. And sometimes the brown, that's a russet leather, which you make very inexpensive shoes from. So sometimes the characteristic of a shoe for an enslaved individual might be made out of the russet, the undyed leather. But with the women's shoes, you see much more, in the time we're showing, you see the much more brightly colored shoes for ladies with the fabrics.
Excellent. So returning maybe to a little bit about what we were talking about with the Continental Army, we were wondering, why was it so difficult for the Continental Army to supply their soldiers with shoes?
There's a lot of reasons for that. The main one would be really that we were colonies when that war broke out. While we had a certain level of industry here, we didn't have it on truly an industrial scale. That's not the case in England. Just looking at shoemakers, here in Williamsburg, we estimate there may have been maybe about 60 people involved in shoemaking, spread out between the different shops in the city. Well, if you went to London, it's a rough estimate, but maybe 16 to 30,000 shoemakers in the city of London. That's an incredible amount of production when you consider that people are being paid per pair. So they're trying to crank shoes out 1 pair a day at the very least. That's not something that we're really going to be able to keep up with on a scale here in North America. Add to that are your materials. Prior to the war, the best materials for shoemaking were coming from England. That was where the highest quality leather was being made. And as colonies, it was usually available at a pretty reasonable price. Tanning leather, that is taking raw skins and hides from cattle and turning it into a finished and preserved material, takes a lot of time, and it's an organic chemistry process. So when you change where you're doing it, you're going to change a lot of the tolerances and kind of science behind it and have to reinvent that process. Add to that with increased pressure put on tanning during the war, because so much of that material is going to be needed for the war effort, you may not be spending the full amount of time on the material that it really requires, because if you don't allow that skin or that hide to fully absorb the tannic acid that is changing its cellular structure, you get something that's called green leather. It looks finished on the outer surfaces, but it's raw in the middle, so it's going to rot. So right off the bat, you're dealing with inferior quality materials and no more production coming from England. So that's going to put a big amount of pressure on local shoemakers to supply the Continental Army. They really aren't going to be able to keep up with that. Soldiers are incredibly hard on shoes. You could be marching miles a day, not taking care of your footwear at the level that it might require. And if they're made out of bad materials, and if they're not well made because somebody's rushing through the construction process, they're going to fall apart really fast. Of course, we also get shoes imported from overseas, coming in from France and from Spain. There are many issues with those shoes as well. They are often very slightly made, so that they don't stand up to the rigors of military service. They're sometimes made out of lower grade materials. There are accounts from the period of those shoes kind of melting and falling apart in the rain, or not lasting a day's march, where the Continental Congress is hoping that they last 3 months. Very often they're being shipped in very small sizes that the soldiers just can't get on their feet. Makes sense from the standpoint of a contractor who's 3,000 miles away and probably doesn't care that much about the person who's getting their shoes. If you're asked to make 500 pairs of shoes, it's going to take you a lot less time to make 500 pairs of size 2 or size 3 as opposed to 500 pairs of size 10 or size 11. So there's big issues with that. And throughout the war, we see even domestic shoemakers cutting corners on production and hiding bad work where it's possible, so that the soldiers just end up with rough stuff and are beating the heck out of it. If you consider all those stories you may have heard of Valley Forge and barefoot soldiers leaving bloody footprints in the snow, those are true, but you have to look at the service before Valley Forge and the 4 months of marching and fighting that were going on for that army before they went into that winter encampment. They just used up whatever they had on their feet. It was just worn out.
So Brian and Teresa were both wondering, when these shoes do get worn out or you cannot use them anymore, can the leather be recycled, or what happens to these worn out shoes?
You can certainly see it. Maybe before the war, not much here, but in London you might see a man walking around with a sack of brooms on his back. He will trade you brooms for old shoes, and they go to a translator shop. A lot of times the shoes are rebuilt. So you can certainly see that happen.
Excellent. And Ashley and Angie were wondering if the shoemaking trade was ever a family business, if you ever saw families engaged in shoemaking, or was it pretty strictly an apprentice and master sort of situation?
Shoemaking is such a common trade that you are going to see often multiple people in the same family as shoemakers. You'd still go through an apprenticeship, whether that's an apprenticeship that you're going through with a parent, an uncle, somebody completely unrelated to you. We see all of that. So it's yes, it could be a family operation. You're also going to see a lot of that closing work being done by members of shoemakers' families. That support role for the trade. We do know of shoemakers who apprentice their children to learn shoemaking from somebody else, because sometimes it's easier for someone else to teach your teenager how to do something, and that's no different in the 18th century. You weren't locked in, though. Just because your parent is a shoemaker does not mean you have to be a shoemaker. But you have a bit of a leg up because you've been surrounded by it. You've probably learned how to make the threads, maybe to help the family along, especially if you are doing that closing work. So it's kind of a natural guide into the trade, but it wasn't necessary. There was an account of a 19th century shoemaker, John O'Neill, who he initially wanted his son to do much better in life than he did, so he's sending him to school. Then he has an injury where he can't work for a while, and his wife and oldest children have to be bringing in more to offset, and he laments that his oldest son is a terrible shoemaker, and his brother mocks him, saying, "No, it's just because you're terrible at teaching him. I'll take him on," because they were both a family and both shoemakers. Within months, he sends the child back and says he's hopeless. He can't do shoemaking. He was just better inclined to something else. So we do see it follow in families. You probably don't have to go very far back in your own family history to find a shoemaker, because it is such a common trade, and we won't have machines to speed it along until the middle of the 19th century. So it is a trade that kind of does lend itself well to passing in families. The last name shoemaker, you have to go much farther back than our time period for that to have any bearing on what your occupation is. By the time we get to the 18th century, we're pretty far removed. Someone with the last name Shoemaker may have had a shoemaker back in their family tree. They probably did, because again, it's very common, but it didn't necessarily mean that someone immediately in your family was a shoemaker.
Great. So we have time for one last question. And I was actually wondering, for this, could we spend a little bit of time discussing the differences between women's shoes and men's shoes in this period?
Sure. Men's shoes are pretty much entirely leather. We're going to use the hide of an ox, bull, or steer for your soles, your insoles, your arch support, and the skin of a lighter, younger animal for the uppers. For women's shoes, while you do still see leather-uppered women's shoes, they're usually the lower end thing by the time we get to our time period. For most of the 18th century, fabric is going to be a more common upper. Calamanco was popular, and you'll see it listed in a lot of advertisements for millineries and merchant shops. It was a tightly woven worsted wool that was glazed, so it's going to stand up to work. They could come in multiple colors, but you can't go wrong with having a pair of black shoes. The heels for women's shoes, to get the height and the shape, they were carved out of wood. Whereas for men's heels, we stack layers of leather. When you stack the layers of leather, you fasten them with wooden pegs. So as your heel grinds down, we can pry off old layers and replace them. This woman's heel, it has to be carved to nominally match the last, the wooden form. They're carved for a particular heel height and toe shape. You can see if I tried to build this the shoe that's going to be made here up to a high heel like this, it's going to be terribly uncomfortable. And you might be able to see it better against the white here because your geometry is off. So we're not, as shoemakers, even if we were women's makers, we're not carving these. These are carved by last makers, and the shoemaker is going to start with this blank and then shape it to the shoe they're making. It's going to be stitched inside a pocket of leather or leather and fabric. So this piece could be leather, it could be fabric. We've got a piece of leather that's hitting the ground. There's the leather insole between you and the shoe, in the heel, and between the heel and the ground. The arch support is also going to be leather in this case as well. You're going to see shoes with that are the uppers are silk. You're going to see embroidered shoes, a lot of different color choices, though a plain black pair is a good pair to have. Leather does come back. Hang on to any fashion long enough, it's going to go out and it's going to come back in again. We start to see goatskin becoming popular for women's shoes as we move towards the 19th century. And go a bit further, heels are going to start to drop. So the primary differences in our time period, the heel height and material, and then the material for the uppers and kind of the overall shape.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Rob, Nicole, and Val, for welcoming us into your shop today and sharing your extensive knowledge on this subject. At this time, we just want to take an opportunity to thank our donors. Programs like this are made possible by the generous support of viewers like you. To learn more about how you can contribute to our programming, please follow the link in the comment section or visit our website at www.colonialwilliamsburg.org. Rob, Nicole, and Val, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us on today?
Thank you for tuning in, watching, and participating. And we look forward to seeing you all visit us in person eventually.